I'd like to welcome everybody to IPI's virtual policy briefing today. Welcome. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a 35-year-old free market public policy think tank based in Dallas, Texas. And we pay attention to issues related to economic growth, and that includes tech and innovation. And so this is right up our alley, but more importantly, it's right up the alley of the policy experts that we have lined up for this panel today. So we appreciate you joining us. I also want to thank those of you who are financial supporters of ours, including those of you who made donations during the registration process. Thank you very much for that. If after this discussion you decide you'd like to know more about IPI or that you would like to become a supporter, I would encourage you to contact Addie Crimmins here at IPI, and she would be more than happy to chat with you about how you can get involved in helping to support our work. We will try to take as many questions as possible today, although I think our discussion is going to be packed, but we will try to take as many questions as possible. So if you have a question to ask, or if you have a point you'd like addressed, please use the Q&A function, which is down at the bottom menu bar of your Zoom client software. If you put it in the chat, feel free to use the chat, but if you put it in the chat, we can't promise to see your question. But if you put it in the Q&A, we will definitely at least see your question, and again, try to get to as many of them as possible. And this discussion today is being recorded. It will be archived on IPI's website and on our YouTube channel. So if you want to share this with other people who were not able to join us, you will be able to do so. As I said, we have a really packed program today, so let's get right to it. So I would like to introduce IPI longtime colleague, Bartlett Clellan, who has put this event together today. And so Bartlett will serve as moderator. Bartlett will introduce the speakers and guide the discussion. So with that, Bartlett, the program is yours.
Thanks, Tom. For anybody who was on here a few minutes ago, you heard me joking about how exciting antitrust can be in our quick sidebar. In a very timely and relevant way that antitrust is being talked about, though I'm not sure everyone is talking about it couched in the terms of antitrust, at least Swifty to Swifty, they're just being frustrated. However, and it makes the point, antitrust has more effect or impact on what we do than you might be aware. And it seems that there are a whole group of folks, left and right, who are interested in making antitrust much more a centerpiece of economic policy in the United States. Results be damned. We'll get into that more. I'm, as always, excited to be with the panels that I get to put together, because I get to reach out to old friends and gather them together and learn from them. And I could hardly think of three better people for this this gathering, whatever we call these days, this remote panel on policy, than these three. So just to go around the horn here, I'm going to, well, my horn, your screen might look different. Jessica Malusian is with CEI. They are, let's see, top line. And guys, feel free to clean up my introductions of you, however you'd like, or add to when it comes to you. She's, first of all, she is a longtime big brain in the space of innovation policy, a friend, and someone who understands these issues inherently and deeply, can speak to them simply, which means she truly understands them. Been with CEI for a long while, and someone I have deepest respect for. I should tell you that approximately half those books behind her are written by her. She is that smart. Next is Jennifer Huddleston, who we used to call J-HUD. Now we need to call Professor J-HUD, who is also a friend. And when it comes to legal issues on about anything, I'm not sure that she can be outmatched. Very smart, and well, except for this, she seems to have this fascination with marathons that it always makes me doubt her intelligence. But nevertheless, here she is. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here. And then Ed Wong, who is with the James Madison Institute. Oh, I should say Jennifer is with NetChoice, I believe they're a C6 for those of you into tax law, but they are a trade association focusing on, they have all sorts of innovation companies as their members, including some social media, but a much broader group than that. And they are proudly center right in the policy prescriptions and their approach. Ed Long is with the James Madison Institute out of Florida. Ed is a new friend to me, but someone who has already impressed me with his diligence and his approach to issues. He has been on a panel for me, I think 2 panels for me, and I always thought a little bit stole the show. He also has this delightful accent that you'll immediately recognize as being from somewhere in the Deep South, but we're still trying to figure out where. But I'll let you guys guess where that is after he talks. And then finally, Tom is going to provide us some color commentary. He's introduced himself. And yes, Tom's a longtime friend and colleague of mine, going back literally decades. So with that, Jessica, let's come to you first. Give us, in the way that you do best, a brief tee up of what is antitrust law broadly, not the nitpicking details, but what should people understand about what antitrust is all about?
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to see all of you. Yeah, I think that it's hard to get the full sense of what antitrust is right now if we don't talk really briefly, I promise, about what it was before Judge Bork came along and kind of cleaned up that body of law. So I'm going to run you through the 20th century really quick here. A couple big laws get passed, the FTC is created, and really at the heart of these antitrust laws, there's a lot of room for interpretation. There's a lot of confusion about what these are supposed to do from situation to situation, from case to case. And as we go through the 20th century, the Supreme Court and lower courts say as much. They say, well, in this case, it really makes us uncomfortable because this company is so big. Or in this case, we don't like it because they're being mean to the smaller guys. It's messy. And the reason why Judge Bork's revolution of the consumer welfare standard and the use of real economic evidence to make your case or refute the case of the government is so important, because it gives us kind of that true north, right? What are we worried about in antitrust? We're worried about our consumers being hurt. Now, that can take the shape of many things. That can be higher prices. That can be less innovation in the industry than you would normally find. That can be lower output. But the North Star here is, are consumers being harmed? Not importantly, are competitors to market leaders being harmed? Because that is actually competition. That's what we're looking for here. That's the feature, not the glitch. So if you can think about it in those terms and think about, and everyone's going to get more into this later, that we've kind of cleaned this body of law up. This is how we've been operating since the early 80s. And now some of the changes we're seeing proposed today are looking to muddy those waters again. I'm going to leave the details to others on that, but that's sort of your 30,000 foot view here. And a very quick example of why it doesn't work practically when you have more than one competing interest at work in antitrust law, when you start getting away from how are consumers faring into other qualifications, is just this very simple example I always like to give, because it kind of gets us in the right mindset. If I'm a smaller competitor and I go in and I complain to my congressman, my senator, the FTC, and I say, this is so unfair, this big market leader, he's got economies of scale and he can charge a lower price than I can. I can't beat that price that he charges to consumers. Well, what's the remedy then? If I'm looking to protect competitors and not just protect the consumer, the remedy is I have to force that big market leader to raise prices. And then who pays those prices? Consumers. So it just, in the most simplistic way, that's sort of the way to think about what was happening before we cleaned all of this up, and some of what I think the problem is with the new policies being presented.
If I can jump in here, Bartlett, really quick, just to add something on. I think that we also should remember that the consumer welfare standard, has been widely accepted, but it's also kind of a great example of one of the places where the kind of conservative or law and economics based jurisprudence has really won out. It's, a prime example where this has generally been accepted and settled because of the advantages it has. And so when we're seeing particularly critics on the left, like Senator Klobuchar in her book on antitrust, discuss this, they're oftentimes very mad about the success that this standard has had in protecting consumers. The fact that they're going after kind of conservative judges and conservative jurisprudence in doing this. And so it's certainly concerning when we start to hear those on the right or those who consider themselves conservative saying things that sound a lot like, say, Senator Klobuchar, given that this is a great example of one of those cases where kind of free market law and economics has really won out in our political system.
Yeah, and I will just agree with that completely and say, you know, that it's a fundamentally conservative idea because Europe doesn't have it. It's part of the US competitive advantage, right? There's your marker for navigating these issues in a confusing time for a lot of people on the right, is that I think the last time I looked it up, the US had 7 of the top 10 global tech companies, depending on how you define that. And Europe had none. So part of that is the regulatory environment, and part of that is the consumer welfare standard to antitrust. So I agree, Jennifer. Professor.
I think I mentioned that Jesse has a way of getting right to the point of things and explaining them that we can all, including me, understand them. So Jessica, let's stick with you for 1 minute. So you mentioned the FTC in your arching description there. So as I see the FTC, I guess as everyone does, they're just merely a regulatory agency as opposed to being the legislature or being the courts. It seems to me that the practical way that antitrust rolls out is that kind of these unelected bureaucrats get empowered along the way. Is that right? Am I missing something in there? Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. So just a couple structural things. You know, you have antitrust work that can be done at the Department of Justice. They can bring cases in Article 3 courts. Yay. And then you have what's going on at the FTC, where they could also bring cases in Article 3 courts, but they have the handy alternative of bringing court cases in their own internal courts. And that questions around this are in front of the Supreme Court this term, because that's a pretty strange setup, right? That feels like it's from the progressive and populist era, and you're not wrong, right? That's a weird thing that came out of there. And I think there's a proposal from Senator Lee to take antitrust out of the FTC and place it only at the DOJ. I think that would clean up a lot of this mess. But you're exactly right. And the FTC itself is sort of bifurcated between consumer harm issues, fraud, and things like that, which I think we can agree are sort of much more legitimate. You know, I don't love an independent agency no matter what, but that's easier to keep within the lines. And then you have this antitrust piece, which I think it shows you that there's a structural problem, right? That these antitrust issues are being pushed so far out of what Congress has said about these laws at the FTC. And the way that it's been working for a long time is that the FTC brings cases and that becomes sort of the rules of the road, right? It's a very common law sort of quasi approach. But now we see this promulgating of rules from the FTC that, like, just as you mentioned, it's a strange break from, you know, that's what Congress is supposed to do. We elect them, we give them the buttons for the lapels, they get to go to Cap Grill. It's part of the deal. They also have to legislate, and there should be oversight. That part of it is not happening as much. I can report to you they are still active at Cap Grill, but you know, to Jennifer's point about consumer welfare standard, these are already laws on the book. These are well-established norms. We really don't need unelected bureaucrats making up more rules based on feelings more than economics.
So, Jennifer, thank you very much, Jessica. I'll give you a rest for a minute, and I'll turn the spotlight to Jennifer or the professor for a moment. So, DC increasingly, to me, feels like the court of Henry VIII, where you know, one day you might become one of his ministers, and the next day you get taken off and your head is chopped off, and it's really tenuous, I think, in the decision deciding whether you want to be close to the center of power or not, political power. Because of that, you're lucky enough to be involved in an industry that has caught the attention of the king and his whatever political class, and that has caused all kinds of attention. A lot of different ways as legislators seek to find a way to come after the industry. At least that's my take. So certainly recently, and as we teed up here, even this last week, DC has been a buzz, the public policy world at least has been a buzz with various talking about various antitrust actions threatened or proposed. Jennifer, can you give us fill us in on some of those details? We don't have to go too deep, but just give us a sense of what the landscape looks like.
So first, I'd like to finish up a little bit about the FTC, kind of building off of what Jessica started with, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's going on Capitol Hill in Congress. Because under Chair Lena Khan at the FTC, we've seen some pretty dramatic departures from the previously agreed upon status quo. And if I can point out, some of these statements around antitrust were bipartisan statements. In fact, most of these statements were by and large bipartisan statements that had been agreed upon by both Republican and Democratic commissioners, had really been guiding stars of the agency to try and keep this very important, very powerful tool objective and less politicized. When we talk about moving away from the consumer welfare standard, I think that's something that's very important to think about, to how you set this up, Bartlett, of right now, we have an objective standard. We have something that is focused on the consumer and that, is actually agnostic about what is the right amount of kind of antitrust enforcement to have, but instead is looking at a very principle-based approach. If you remove the consumer welfare standard and you allow an agency like the FTC to just pursue antitrust either with much lower standards for bringing those cases or with very amorphous standards of basically deciding what those preferred industries and preferred players are, you're removing that objective standard and providing something that's much more easily politicized and subjective. So while it may be technology companies that currently have the ire today, in many cases, there wouldn't be those guardrails anymore to prevent it from spilling over to any other number of industries, whether it's retail, like Walmart and Target, or whether it's, the oil and gas industry or any other number of players. When we look at what's going on in Capitol Hill, a lot of the proposals currently in Congress would potentially give the FTC more power and would make antitrust less objective and more politicized. I'm going to talk about three of the key proposals, which are proposals that are going through the Senate right now. The first of which is the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, sometimes called ICOA, and it's S2992. This has really been probably the most radical reform we've seen. It's put forward by Senator Amy Klobuchar, and it theoretically does something to do with self-preferencing and with these kind of big tech players. But when you look down at what the bill actually does, first off, it's already a somewhat outdated bill. The way the market cap is constructed in this bill, one of the players that it was designed to go after is gradually dropping out, where by the time that, the bill may be enacted, who knows if Meta will be covered or not. It's dropped so much. At the same time, we're seeing other players like Walmart continue to grow and could eventually be covered by the bill. So the idea that this proposal is only going to affect these big tech companies isn't necessarily right. And it also goes to the problem with trying to do this through legislation in the first place. We're seeing that this remains a dynamic and changing industry. And if we just focus on this particular moment, this particular status quo, we may be missing the forest for the trees. So think about how in the early 2000s, you would see headlines about how MySpace is a natural monopoly, how Nokia is the cell phone king that could never be caught, and how Yahoo clearly won the search wars. If we'd been seeing those headlines and acting on those headlines with dramatic changes to antitrust, who knows if we as consumers would have gotten the better products, the different iterations that looked incredibly different. In fact, if we look at something like the Microsoft case, which is usually held up by advocates as kind of the gold standard, there are statements about how Microsoft missed the mobile window, in part because it was so busy focused on antitrust that by the time the browser wars were solved, all of us were accessing the internet in new and different innovative ways. And we're actually seeing these dynamic changes go on before our eyes right now. I sometimes joke that I'm old now because I'm a millennial. And like when I talk to the students I teach, it's like if I'm talking about Instagram or Twitter, I'm talking about completely different social media platforms than are what's really cool with the law students in Gen Z today. We're also seeing dramatic innovations around the idea of search. both with Gen Z that is much more visual forward, as well as with things that have just come out like the ChatGPT app and AI and this kind of generative AI that's going to change the way many of us do search. It's going to change the way we encounter and discover new information. So in a lot of ways, S2992 is something that isn't able to, not only is it problematic because of how it would change the consumer welfare standard, it's also not something that's really up to date with what the current industry looks like. And that's very concerning too, because you're looking at regulation that is going to have huge burdens, change the way that regulators interact, as well as, is not reflecting our experience as consumers today. The other two bills I'd like to quickly highlight is the Open App Market Act. That is the bill concerning app stores that we've seen come about. A lot of the concerns that have been expressed around this bill particularly relate to cybersecurity and also to the fact that we already have a wide array of app stores to choose from. In fact, most of us are already engaged in a practice called multi-homing. So you may be using multiple app stores at any given time. If you have a Windows computer, you may be using their store. If you have a PlayStation at home, you may be using their store. If you have an Apple phone, you may be using their store. And if you have an Android phone, you may have multiple app stores on that single device already. What this is looking at doing is basically forcing platforms to operate a certain way and intervening in what are largely business decisions and contracts between large players. The final bill I want to mention is one that's kind of moved about separately, but it's recently come back in the news a lot, and that's the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Now, I would argue that, like many bills in DC, that's the biggest misnomer because it neither preserves journalism nor competition. And in fact, it would be something that would allow the government to really allow various news organizations to collude with one another, which is an anti-competitive behavior in every other case, if I checked right. And it's also allowing the government to really distinguish who it thinks are journalists. So one of the great things about the internet is that we now have had a whole host of new platforms come up in ways that we're experiencing news in different ways. And somebody may not consider themselves a journalist, but may be a large news source for any number of people in their local community. Think about some of those, unique areas of information you may have searched for online that there are particular people who are always going to have them. What this would actually do is result in more paywalls. It would be effectively a link tax on these large platforms. And again, who's going to lose out? It's the consumers. What's fascinating is now, we're seeing a lot of talk about potentially adding this bill into things, but yet the opposition to this bill is huge from across the political platform. You have both places like Breitbart and, ourselves at NetChoice, people that certainly consider themselves on the conservative side or on the center right opposing this bill, but you also have places like EFF. You have places like Public Knowledge opposing this bill as well for the fact that there are huge problems with it. So I think that that's, another thing to highlight that's certainly going on. We continue to see these bills move very quickly through markup without a lot of the regular procedures. So there also hasn't been that really thorough debate that I think many of us would expect to have, going back to kind of Jessica's point about Congress, particularly when you consider what dramatic changes these proposals would have.
So people know, thank you, Jennifer. People know Jennifer really is a professor, and I think we just got a free lecture. So make your donation to IPI now. That's my best pitch. All right, Ed, let's come to you. I've already tagged British history, so it seems awfully appropriate that you're here. There's definitely a state dimension to antitrust law.
Yep.
And it seems that states in general, the state legislators, are increasingly excited about throwing in one way or another on technology issues, and particularly the misnamed big tech, but the social media platforms and platforms in general. Can you give us a couple of examples, and specifically, you're from Florida, you live in Florida, you work for the Florida State think tank. Florida is increasingly becoming a focus of attention for how to do policy right around economics. Can you give me some sense of what what Florida legislators are thinking along these lines, and will it be a good or bad example
So
for the country?
I think just kind of prefacing this conversation, I think Jennifer actually teed me up pretty nicely. We talk about kind of the antitrust legislation at the federal level, but as has been said, there's definitely this state dimension to it, and I think a lot of this kind of state dimension has been caused by the slow movement of antitrust at the federal level. So you have state lawmakers kind of wanting to get involved in this, and these bills can be particularly harmful at the state level. We talk about the App Store bills; they've been considered in around 12 states, and they're going to be highly disruptive to the ecosystem. Allowing side loading is going to cause massive cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And as we move into 2023, these bills will certainly crop up again. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw one in Florida. I think Arizona is also a high risk. I think Louisiana is also a high risk. North Carolina, the list could go on. And also issues of content moderation is also getting wrapped up into this sort of big tech antitrust debate. And certainly I expect to see more content moderation bills. Florida could well be in the Supreme Court over its deplatforming bill, and other issues going on down there in the state. And I think the concern for me is that Florida has always portrayed itself as a friendly place to do business. It's always positioned itself as kind of the anti-California, the anti-New York. With these bills, it's only going to raise cost of operating in the state. It's only going to create a patchwork of laws that's going to make it difficult for companies like Facebook, like Twitter, like Microsoft, like Apple to operate. And ultimately, that just comes down to the consumer who has to pay for it in terms of reduced innovation and higher cost. My hope is that these state lawmakers start to embrace sort of positive tech policies, but I'm fairly pessimistic as we move into the new legislative session, and that's why I think kind of organizations like NetChoice, CEI, JMI, are important about in highlighting these dangers to show that ultimately there's another direction they can move in.
Thank you for that. And that's, a little bit depressing. And I'm afraid as I go to Tom, I might just get more of that when I ask what's going on in Texas. But there's been antitrust action in Texas, certainly conversations about it. And there's been other adjacent legislation to these issues. Tom, what can you tell us about that?
Well, Texas seems to be in competition with Florida to see who can be the most aggressive in these areas. I think Texas is accustomed to being thought of as the most aggressive red state, and Texas feels like it's being shown up right now by Florida. So I think the gauntlet has been thrown down. Unfortunately, this is a competition to see who can put forth the worst ideas and the worst pieces of legislation. Both the Florida bill that was related to content moderation and the Texas bill were both essentially immediately enjoined by the first court that took a look at them. Because from our standpoint, there are significant First Amendment problems with these bills, and there's also antitrust problems with these bills. We titled this event very particularly, "Should the center right embrace the idea of enhanced antitrust?" And I want to sort of partially focus my comments on that point, because I think what we're seeing people who claim to be for limited government. We're seeing people who claim to be for free markets. We're seeing people who say they don't like regulation, where they are against the administrative state. But in this area, they are doing a 180 on all of that rhetoric, on all of that jargon. And I grew up in a very religious home, and we had our own religious jargon, just words people would just throw around. And I remember as a young person thinking, okay, but what does that really mean? What do you actually mean when you say that? And you try to pin somebody down. Okay, so you said that was a blessing or whatever. Well, what does that mean? And people couldn't explain what they meant. They're just using jargon. And I think what we're seeing now is a lot of elected officials, particularly those who aspire toward higher office, are behaving in a way that is completely inconsistent with the jargon that they throw around. When you talk about the consumer welfare standard, and this is going to be dramatically oversimplified, but in this area of policy, you really do have to make a choice. You have to make a choice. Who's going to be the priority, the consumer or the competitor? You really do have to make that choice. It influences every other step down the decision tree. Part of, I think, why, and Jessica talked about this, I think part of why in the US our economy has been so globally dominant in these new areas is that we have put the consumer first. We've not put competitors' welfare first, and that has allowed American companies to gain scale. And in Europe, they have all sorts of regulations that make it hard for companies to even get, I mean, why would you start a company there in the first place? But then second, it becomes extremely difficult to gain scale. And what we've done in the US is we have allowed companies like Amazon to gain scale. And the reason we've done that is that the benefit to consumers is just overwhelmingly demonstrable. I mean, I have in the last several weeks, several times ordered products from Amazon and had them delivered later the same day or the next day. And I never had to leave the house. I never had to burn a gallon of gas. That's extraordinary consumer welfare. That's almost an unmeasurable amount of consumer welfare compared to before Amazon. And none of that consumer welfare would have been recognized if we took the sort of European competition policy approach to where, as a company grew and tried to gain scale, they were guilty until proven innocent, essentially. And so I think that I love the point that was made that this is an area where those of us who use jargon like limited government, free market, innovation, for those of us who use that kind of jargon, we won in this area. We lose in so many other areas, but we won in this area. And I don't know why we would want to try to give that back. The whole heart of the consumer welfare standard is this idea that government doesn't act unless there is demonstrable harm. And that is completely consistent with the overall view that free market, limited government, conservative types take. Our overall view of regulation in all areas is that we don't want the government regulating in a prescriptive way. We don't want the government saying our brains are so big and we're so smart that we can anticipate what's going to happen in the future, so we're going to write regulations now for the future. Instead, conservatives and limited government folks have embraced this idea that we don't want government to act until and unless there's demonstrable harm. And so the consumer welfare standard is completely consistent with that. And so going back on that, going back to a approach, the reason I'm sort of hesitating here is that I don't even think the people who are advocating this are thoughtfully advocating a different approach. They're not really saying we need to embrace European style competition policy. That's not really what they're saying. What they're really saying is that our grassroots are angry at big tech. And so what weapons are at our disposal? And antitrust just happens to be one of those weapons. So the idea of not giving the government more power to be intrusive in marketplace, that is completely consistent with sort of the overall free market limited government approach that we take to all of these things. And then finally, I just want to point out that, I wrote the description for this event, and if anybody read the description, there's some sarcastic language in there because I've been amused, frankly, at how many of our Republican, in many cases, legislators, both at the state and federal level, because antitrust has really never been a center-right thing. We don't even understand it. And you see people just using the language in such a way that demonstrates they don't really even understand it themselves. I mean, the bill we had in Texas, like the first paragraph says, we declared that social media platforms are common carriers. Well, that's just not how it works. That's just literally not how it works. You don't get to just make a declaration that a certain silo of companies are common carriers. But even then, common carriers don't lose their First Amendment protections against compelled speech. So, even doing that in a sense, does not address the problem that people are animated about in the first place. So it's a little bit amusing. It's not just contradictory, but it's amusing to see people on the center right who are, again, accustomed to defending free markets, limited government, and a very limited role for regulation, to suddenly be doing a 180 and championing those things. I also want to point out that the constitutional problems with these approaches, I think, are obvious. And that's why I think a lot of us are fairly confident that when the courts do actually begin thoroughly interacting with these things, those of us who are skeptical of these approaches are going to come out on top. For one thing, there is something in the neighborhood of a commerce clause problem with states trying to regulate interstate commerce. And I rarely hear anybody bring this up. But, you know, why should Louisiana be able to regulate Apple's, app store? We have a commerce clause that gives the federal government an active obligation to prevent states from regulating interstate commerce. So states have the right to do consumer protections and things like that. But to me, there's sort of a conflict just with the whole idea of states engaging in antitrust, unless somehow they're talking about a company that is entirely within the boundary of their state. I think there's a huge commerce clause problem here. So that's a constitutional problem. And the second problem is one that I'm very fond of talking about lately, which is the First Amendment protection against compelled speech. And I just did earlier today, I did an interview with a German researcher who was just really puzzled. He didn't understand why this was even controversial in the United States. He understands our First Amendment better than we do. When you have folks on the center right insisting that Colorado should not be allowed to mandate that a baker put a message on a cake that baker doesn't believe in, that is the exact same principle about social media platforms not being compelled by government to host speech that they disagree with. The First Amendment does not simply protect your right to just spout off your hot sports opinion anytime and anywhere you want. Indeed, perhaps a more important protection of the First Amendment is the protection against compelled speech by the government. The government cannot force you to engage in political speech that you don't want to engage in, and it can't force you to host or to support political speech that you don't want to host or support. And as private actors, these social media platforms have the very same constitutional First Amendment protection against compelled speech that the Colorado baker has. And so I think our folks on the center right are not taking the time to think through all of this. And then the final point I'd like to make is just political reality. It's always a bad idea to create government power under the assumption that it'll always be you who wields it. I'm reminded of how Senator Harry Reid did away with the filibuster for judicial nominations, and it had turned out that Mitch McConnell got to wield that in order to get more federal judges through than like any previous Senate session. Both sides, in a way, have a interest in limited government, because if you create new powers, you're not always going to be the one who gets to decide how they're used. So for Republicans like Senator Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and people like that, who have sort of flirted with the idea of endorsing Senator Klobuchar's antitrust bill and things like that, don't assume that power is only going to be used in the way you prefer for it to be used by the people you prefer to be using it. And if we're going to start eroding our First Amendment protections so that we can punish big tech for assumed harms, then don't be surprised if government with other people in charge don't use those same erosions of the First Amendment to take away some of your precious privileges on the center right. I think we have to. There are practical reasons, not just theoretical reasons, for being intellectually consistent on public policy. There's a principled reason just to be intellectually consistent, but there's also the practical reason that you forge that hammer, and you won't always be the one to wield it.
Just kind of piggybacking, I think, a little bit on what Tom was saying. I also get the sense that a lot of kind of the animosity toward big tech at the moment is warped in kind of this rural urban kind of split in the United States, kind of the coastal versus kind of the interior, right? Is that it's very easy for a state legislator in Texas or Florida to say that this is kind of the New York liberal elite, or this is kind of the Silicon Valley liberal elite, than it is to kind of actually address kind of the structural problems. And I think kind of that's where a lot of this is coming from, is actually it's not necessarily, or more so that kind of big tech is sort of the I guess the flow through for this kind of partisan divides we see in the country, and also kind of the cultural divides.
Yeah, and I should also add that one of my pet peeves, I mean, we've probably all had private conversations with legislators who are moving these kinds of bills, and they'll acknowledge privately that, yeah, I understand there's a First Amendment problem or whatever. But their attitude is, but I'm gonna sponsor the bill anyway, and I'm gonna vote for it anyway. We'll let the courts worry about it. That's a really lousy way of legislating. Legislators take pretty much the same vow that judges take. They take pretty much the same vow of the Constitution that Supreme Court justices take. I mean, you should not be sponsoring a bill that you suspect has First Amendment problems or Commerce Clause problems. But there's very much, I mean, having witnessed this in Texas firsthand, having testified in Austin 3 or 4 times on this bill, there's very much a let's just throw it at the wall, see if anything sticks kind of approach going on here. And, not only is that an unprincipled form of legislating, it's also an expensive form of legislating, because now you are obligating your state to get involved in litigation, your attorney general. My understanding is the attorney general office in Texas is the single largest law firm in the country. And so you're expending state resources on efforts that were at least partially futile. So what we're looking at here is just a bad bit of policy making. And, from an economic theory standpoint, I always try to remind people that those of us who believe in markets, we still believe in markets, even if the market delivers a result that we don't prefer. Just because a market doesn't behave the way I think it should behave doesn't mean I should use the power of government to shape it or change it. In fact, that is a progressive instinct. It is a progressive instinct to say, here's the result I want, or here's how I think this market ought to behave. And if it doesn't, by God, I will knock it into shape by using the power of government. That's a progressive instinct. That's not a conservative free market instinct. But our side is starting to, at least in this area, on the center right, a lot of policymakers are starting to think like progressives. They have an end result they want, and by any means necessary, whether it's antitrust, whether it's Section 230, whatever it is, whether it's constructing whole new legal frameworks around content moderation, just by any means necessary, they want to achieve this goal. And that is not a center-right impulse. That's a progressive left impulse.
I do think there's a challenge with legislators who write sloppy legislation or write what I'll say cynical legislation, knowing that it very well could be unconstitutional, and having those exact same legislators or legislatures then complaining about how the judicial system is overrunning the laws that they have put into place, or how the executive, the administrative bodies in the states or the federal government are running wild with parts that with points that they never intended. Well, it goes back to the legislators in this country, of course, hold a great deal of authority and power, and yet they seem very quick to hand it off.
I think that's a really excellent point, Bartlett. I'm glad you brought that up, because as you know, judicial supremacy, is a problem for some of us. But arguably, that problem has been created by legislatures not asserting their, constitutional rights and their place in the system, and leaving a vacuum for the judicial branch to always be coming in and cleaning things up.
Rights and duty, I would say. There's you raise your hand and take an oath for a reason. It's not for nothing. It's not to go hang out. I mean, that's why we're in think tanks. We get to hang out at the Capitol Hill Club. We don't have to really do all that legislating stuff.
Right.
So they're trying to take our jobs. I'll come back to you, Jessica, in 1 minute. You comment on that. But Jennifer, let me come to you real quick. And Tom tipped his hat at this, but I think we should at least spend another minute or so on it. So we've heard a lot of interest from the center right, the GOP, that's animating this debate, animating the push on some of this legislation, is solving the problem of, and you kind of fill in the blank. It's social media, big tech, platforms. It all gets interchanged. They all mean I guess the same thing, assuming they know exactly what they're talking about. But let's, for the moment, stipulate that they are correct. There's this, the platforms are all biased and they're all doing these crazy politically motivated things, not in the best interest of business, et cetera. And let's stipulate that they're going to pass this legislation, and everyone's going to applaud on Capitol Hill or in the state houses. Is it going to solve their problem?
Short answer is no. Antitrust is a tool designed for a very specific purpose, and that has to do with competition in the marketplace and protecting consumers. In the case of many of these concerns, it's a sledgehammer to a large and booming sector of the American economy, when even if those concerns, as you kind of stated, Bartlett, even if we kind of accept the presumptions that are leading to those concerns, are better dealt with a scalpel, with very specific ways of addressing those concerns. There's no guarantee, even if you got kind of the breakup of some of these platforms, that you'd see changes to content moderation. There's no guarantee that smaller platforms would moderate differently. And in fact, smaller platforms might have fewer resources to engage in the very important types of content moderation that many of us want, that keep, violent and obscene content out of our daily social media feeds. So I think it's very concerning when we hear calls to use antitrust as kind of this silver bullet to solve whatever kind of the woes of the day are with tech policy. But again, going back to what Tom and Jessica have said, if you make these changes, you're giving these changed, very powerful tools to, right now, Lena Khan at the FTC, as if that's going to somehow lead to defending conservative speech. Not to mention that once you've kind of opened this door to allow these more subjective and political purposes for antitrust, you're not only allowing that for the things that you may want to achieve as a political goal, but for other people to achieve their political goals, which may be very different than what yours are.
Thank you for that. By the way, I'll remind folks, excuse me, if you have questions, please load them into the Q&A. I see there, we got answered. Okay, there was one. We've taken care of that one. So please, more questions if you have them. In the meantime, Jessica, let me come back to you, because as I mentioned in the introduction of you, I truly appreciate your clarity and kind of getting to the heart of the issue, and often with a chuckle, and I enjoy that. But so we got a lot on the table today around antitrust policy. It's in the states, federal, moving for different reasons, but kind of animated by this irritation with maybe disappointment in a particular industry, but using broader applications. Where do you think all of this leaves us, I guess, in a sense of public policy, but also politically?
I think it's, for those of you who are kind of coming to all of this new and you're looking at serving new, I don't envy you. This is a confusing time to be a conservative, I think. There's a lot of infighting about what it means. Does that mean you have conservative values that you would like to impose on others through the coercive nature of government? Some people argue yes. Many prominent, successful people argue yes these days. Does it mean you're a limited government type? You want restraint in small government. Mostly you want to be left alone. You can decide how you want to do everything. That's really like a ball that's up in the air, right? I mean, I'm sure in Texas, you're working that out. In Washington, we're working that out. The political backdrop is that there's a big split on the right now. And it's sometimes a civil one and mostly not really. It's kind of nasty. And I think what we've drilled down on here today is that a lot of times when people on the right are interested in pursuing antitrust actions against big tech, it's because they're upset not about antitrust issues, but about social media and content moderation issues. But what are you going to do about that? That's new. That's weird. They're not quite a newspaper. They're not quite a publisher. I don't know. Seems complicated. What about antitrust? We could just break them up. We could just hit them in the face and run and see if that doesn't make it better. And of course, as we've all been saying, that has nothing to do with center right sort of traditional values of how we govern and what we stand behind. You can't be for parents being in control and school choice and all these sort of decentralized, empowering the individual and taking that power out of even state governments, let alone federal governments, and sit here and say, well, what we really need is for Lena Khan at the FTC to stick up for conservatives online. I mean, you can't listen, and it's not that there isn't a problem. It's not that it's not frustrating, and it's not that it's not perfect. It's just that part of the right is having this crisis of confidence in the market, being able to solve problems. So I think that sometimes us free market types get accused of saying, oh, well, you're in denial that there's this content moderation problem. I'm really not. I just trust that the market will find better and quicker solutions to address that than I do the federal or the state government. That's
and I think also kind of, we're seeing that there are market responses to this, right? Is that, Donald Trump set up his Truth Social platform, Parler was set up. I think kind of my concern is if we start imposing these onerous antitrust restrictions on large companies, ultimately that's going to stop the innovation coming at the lower level, right? Is that so that outlets that conservatives might be able to find on alternative platforms, suddenly that disappears.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because the biggest risk of antitrust is the market solution that it prevents, right? I'm not here to tell you that there's not being a free marketer doesn't mean that I think the perfect market conditions exist at all times, everywhere, no matter what. Of course not. But I do think that in general, people on the right know enough to know the market's probably going to do a better job if you have about the right rules in place in addressing these concerns and catering to people's preferences than bureaucrats in DC or weird state laws that are probably Commerce Clause violations, certainly are preempted by Section 230, and just don't practically work and fundamentally misunderstand how these industries work. Some of the problem right now is that there's a learning curve for how these businesses operate. And you can really get a sense for that if you tune in on the antitrust or content moderation hearings in Washington. There's a real knowledge gap there that exists anyway with regulation and is even bigger because these are kind of frontier economy industries, right? This is all relatively new to us and we're feeling our way through it. And I think that there's a big group of Americans that aren't convinced that the market still works here. Like, does it work now? Does it work even when Amazon's this big? Does it work even when Facebook has this market share? Like, it does. I feel confident it does. I think, as you were saying, we already see that, right? Parler did find another place to get hosted. There are alternatives. Decentralized social media is probably going to be another big revolution in things. But if you get in there and you regulate, even with the best of intentions, you often inadvertently end up freezing those big leaders in place, right? Because they can afford to litigate around it. They can afford to comply. But the guy sitting in his garage who has the next great idea that's really going to address some of this frustration and anger on the right, which I understand completely, he doesn't have a team of attorneys. He doesn't have a big firm doing his accounting. And that's where you kind of short circuit the innovative cycle. And I think that's the thing I worry about most, especially coming from the right. I expect that on the left. Those are conversations we have very typically on the left. But from the right, it's, no, you can't make Chick-fil-A be open on Sundays just because it really sucks when you want Chick-fil-A and then you're like, dang it, Sunday. Like, that's frustrating. That's a real problem. If I own Chick-fil-A, I would work it out. But the point is, I don't. It's their company. They have their policies. And even though it's not perfect to me, we respect each other's private property in this country, right? And for the most part, that's how we proceed. And that's why we're global leaders in so many areas. So my hope is that Republicans and Democrats remember that sometimes getting reelected or clicks or getting on cable news isn't the most important thing to do with your time legislating. Sometimes it's a good idea to really educate yourself, think critically about this, think in a principled way, and exercise some restraint.
Bartlett, can I just underscore something Jessica said that I think is terribly important, because
I hope it's about Chick-fil-A.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as soon as we're done here, I'll have to dash out and get one now because I'm hungry. Those of us who are defenders of markets, as I said earlier, we don't necessarily defend markets because they give us our desired outcomes, but we don't defend them because they're perfect or even close to perfect. We just defend them because they're better than the alternative. A market that is run from the bottom up by consumer choice is better than a market that is run from the top down by government fiat, by government control. This is the whole point of Hayek, right? And the knowledge problem and everything. But beyond that, those of us who are proponents of markets, we don't have to defend that they're perfect. We also don't have to defend them in any given slice in time, because markets are a process, and markets work through these problems over time as a process. So if you have faith in markets as, not perfect, but better than the alternative, the likelihood is that whatever the perceived problem is in the market right now, the likelihood is that the market itself will come up with a system or a situation that is more pleasing to consumers 2 or 3 or 5 years from now than we're looking at right now. And when the underlying issue behind this entire conversation is that what people are angry about is content moderation, but yet they're talking about antitrust, and the two have nothing to do with each other. Okay, but on the content moderation thing, fundamentally, companies want to please as many consumers as possible, and they want to please as many shareholders as possible. And if a company is doing policies that are undermining it with consumers, that are causing it to lose trust with its consumers and its users, ultimately the market's going to punish that company, and that company can either respond in such a way that saves the company, or it can fail to respond and it can go under. That's what markets do, but the market is a process. So for those of us, again, who'd like to use this jargon of believing in markets, you don't have to defend the result of a market. You don't have to defend the current status quo or the current slice in time. It is a superior way of delivering value to consumers than a government-directed process. And that really is the alternative. And as Jessica suggested, if you start embracing antitrust, you're saying, I have more confidence in government to run these things than I do in the market. And what you're going to do is you're going to create friction, and you're going to create roadblocks for markets to function instead of helping them to function more efficiently.
One thing I wanted to mention was not exactly a rabbit trail, but is not exactly part of the economic impact we talked about today. It is a very common practice. So I represented the tech industry for a dozen years. The smallest companies to the largest. And it is quite common that an exit strategy, is what we call an exit strategy, if someone's starting a company, their exit strategy, how are they going to get out of the business? How are they going to make money? Is simply be able to sell it to a larger company. In a world of this kind of antitrust, heavy-handed antitrust regulatory system, you have companies, big companies, distracted, as Jessica laid out. They have less money, resources, and time to provide an opportunity for those small companies to have that exit strategy. So not only do you have this regulatory that they have tried to address by weird and arbitrary definitions of who these laws are going to apply to. I think we heard that earlier about market caps and number of customers and whatnot. But there's this secondary effect where these very same companies who would become an exit strategy for these entrepreneurs, that will no longer exist. And, so far as I know, most of us aren't ponying up millions and millions of dollars to get these entrepreneurs over the threshold of being able to start a company. So it really is much more damaging to a broad swath of economy. And if you think it's going to stop in technology, and in fact, I think somebody already name-checked Walmart here in this conversation, who will fall into the definition, or it appears they will. This will grow. And I would say I'm cynical enough. Sorry, I'm Gen X. I'm not millennial like Jennifer, or I think Tom is also millennial. But I'm deeply cynical, being Gen X. And it seems to me that once you have this kind of a law in the books, that number that designates the market cap and who is included, it just gets arbitrarily moved along as the next company that's almost there. Facebook's almost there. It drops. Well, now we need to lower it. Oh, now there's this other industry and company, and they're almost there, so we lower it again. And pretty soon we just end up with a lot more heavy-handed regulation. We do have one question, and because they put big tech appropriately in quotes and didn't make it a real thing, I want to read it. It's a little bit long, but I'm going to read this to you guys, and it's from Mr. or Miss Anonymous. So thank you to you. That's an interesting name. If the argument is that conservatives who are pushing to employ antitrust to break up big tech would rescind a seismic and important conservative win with Bork's consumer welfare standard, why haven't Democrats capitalized on this? Wouldn't this be an even stronger incentive for Democrats to unite with pro-antitrust conservatives and pass legislation to sully this pro-competition welfare standard?
Well, they're trying. Senator Klobuchar almost peeled off enough Republican senators to get her bill to the floor. I mean, it was very, very close. So the question is anticipatory of reality, because that is what they're trying to do, and they have come surprisingly close. Now we don't know what, how that vote would have come out on the floor. We don't know what the House would do, and of course we're going to have a slightly different House in the next session. But this was actually a very real possibility in this past year, this past legislative session, that something like that would have happened.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Bartlett,
I would say that it's this. I'll be really quick. I totally agree. That is sort of what I think all of us have been working on explaining to certain members of the legislature, that when you get to talking to people, it often is the case, the vast majority of time, what you're really upset about is the content moderation, not the antitrust. Okay, well then here's some things that you should know that are probably going to happen if you vote for something like this, or you support something like this, is the conversation I think my fellow panelists and I have been having a lot the last year or two. And they are caught in that, weird zone of, okay, I hear what you're saying. That's right. I don't like bigger government. I don't like this stuff. But also, there's something performative about having to give a little bit of face time to these ideas that read, much more like they'd come from the left. But I think that there is a grassroots portion of the right that really wants something done. And, part of their job is to be responsive to what constituents want, right? They're walking that line. I'm sure everyone who's elected is. And I think that they've gotten caught up in that. I think in the new House, it's not that new, but a little new, you'll see that shift a little bit, because I think Republicans at least will start championing more of the social media legislation and back off a little bit on the straight antitrust stuff, because it is just so out of step with what that party has stood for a really long time.
Bartlett,
If
can I mention something? Because there's something going on that we haven't talked about so far that we really should get in before our time is up. You mentioned this idea of small companies getting purchased by larger companies. And very often that's why someone starts a small company. Their business plan is to get bought. It happens in the pharmaceutical space and everything. So literally this week, the trial is beginning. A very important antitrust trial is starting, where Meta bought a company called Within, who has a virtual reality fitness application. And this is the same thing we've always seen in the software world, same thing we see in other worlds. Some small company comes up with something really, really cool, and then a big company says, we want that. We have the scale, we have the resources to really expand that and make something of that. And there was a complaint at the FTC that this is a violation of antitrust. The FTC staff voted not to take action, but the FCC chair, Lita Khan, decided to anyway. And so the FCC sued to stop this, and the trial literally is happening this week. So, the argument is that Meta already has a home fitness app, right? Well, maybe their app sucks. Maybe, maybe they've realized that, this one's better. We want this to be part of what we do. And this is historically, this is how Microsoft grew from just being an operating system company, right? They kept buying new technologies and new companies and building it into the operating system. And it's why you have a one-stop shop with an operating system that can do just about everything. but I mean, this is actually this is part of why this discussion is timely today. Is that this trial is actually starting this week, where a newly activist FTC is trying to intervene to stop the way that hitherto up to this point we have allowed companies to do this. We've allowed companies to buy up smaller companies and fold them into their product, invest in them, do something with them. And, it's not like the owners of Within, it's not like Meta took it by force. I mean, they sold it. They willingly sold it. They built the company with the hope that something like this would happen. But now you have an activist FTC coming in and trying to stop that transaction on antitrust grounds, and not on the consumer welfare standpoint, but on this competition type of philosophy.
In fact, we have a whole economic term for it. It's so common that's called creative destruction. Companies get bought up, they get torn apart, they get reassembled, they become something new, and on it goes to theoretically better serve consumers. Of course, it might not, and then that company goes out of it gets bought up by somebody else. So let me, actually, there's a very quick question that I'll get to just because it's quick. And then I'm going to wrap up, come to each of you to tell us how to get hold of you and all that kind of great stuff, how to get more information. So the quick question is, do y'all think that the regulatory changes being proposed is driven by the need to compete with Europe? Anybody want to take that one?
I'll jump in here. I'd say it's quite the opposite. We should be concerned about how much some of these regulatory changes proposed look like European policy, particularly because so many of the European policies are targeting American innovation leaders, in part because Europe doesn't have its own innovation leaders. So when you can't compete, regulate until regulate up and harm the guys who have been successful in the market. We've seen complaints about this when discussing things like the Digital Markets Act in Europe, and it's very concerning how much some of these proposals borrow from those European points of view.
Jennifer, perhaps they were asking if we needed to compete with European regulatory standards that destroy industry. Maybe that was the question, but thank you for that. So I think Jessica, go ahead.
So I was gonna say, I also think kind of, it's not just potentially trying to, compete with Europe. You've also seen the UK Competition Markets Authority being increasingly activist in the antitrust front. They were the ones who basically said that Facebook or Meta have to sell Giphy, and there's no market there. But it's certainly not just Europe; it's also coming out of London, that dangerous kind of trend of over-regulating.
Well, that's depressing. Jessica, how do people find more information about CEI or your writing, etc.?
CEI.org.
Clever.
Read it, love it, live it. CEI.org. Thank you guys so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Jennifer, same question to you.
Yeah, netchoice.org. And then we are also on most, if not all, of your favorite social media platforms under that as well. And then I am on Twitter tweeting about antitrust, content moderation, data privacy, and marathon running at JR Huddles.
And Ed, same thing for you.
So jamesmadison.org. I do have Twitter, but it's not nearly as impressive as Jen Huddleston's marathon running tweets.
So Tom, I'll let you do IPIs after I bump this back to you. From my point of view, wonderful panel. Thank all three of you very much. I so appreciate, or all four of you, but the three of you not involved with IPI, thank you so much. I truly appreciate your time and energies. Great, deepest respect for you guys. People should, if you're not following these folks and you're interested in public policy, you should do so. They do a lot more than what's been reflected here, and they're wonderful and all those things. And then to you and to the audience, have a very happy holidays and a safe new year. And we will see you with more of these on the other side of that. With that, Tom, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Bartlett. Yes, we at IPI very much appreciate the panelists joining us for this event, and we appreciate all of our attendees. You can find a lot more information about tech policy, innovation policy, and social media at ipi.org, our website. We've also done a series of podcasts on this idea of markets and are markets perfect, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're interested in that, on any podcast platform, you can look up IPI Policy Basics podcast. And we love talking about markets, and we love talking about the superiority of a market-based approach to a government-driven approach. So you'll find lots of resources there. This is our last virtual policy briefing of the year. We've done many of them since the pandemic. And even though we're approaching 2023 as a back to normal year, we will still be doing virtual policy briefings because they have their place. They're very convenient both for the panelists and for the attendees. So you can go to our website at ipi.org. You can sign up, and you will get notices and you will get invitations for all of those events. So with that, Bartlett, thank you for moderating. And we'll wish everyone a good afternoon, a good end of the year, and if it's not too early, happy holidays. Thank you very much.